The morning Sadie Garrison arrived in Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory. She was carrying a dead man's rifle, a live man's debt, and the kind of quiet that settles into a person after they have buried something they loved. It was the spring of 1878, and Dry Creek was the sort of town that existed more out of stubbornness than prosperity. A handful of buildings stood along a single main road, half of them leaning against the prairie wind, as if they had simply given up pretending to be permanent. The general store, the livery, the saloon called the Copper Nail, and a post office that doubled as the sheriff's office when the sheriff bothered to show up, which was less often than the town would have liked. Sadie stepped down from the stagecoach with her single trunk and her rifle slung across her back, and the first thing she heard was laughter, not the warm kind. 3 men were sitting on the porch of the Copper Nail, boots up on the railing, hats pushed back, watching her the way men watch things they had already decided they understood. "Lord have mercy," said one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Chester Hollies who made his living trading horses and made his reputation talking about himself. "They sending us city women now. She won't last the season," said another, a younger man called Denny Frath who had not lasted a full winter on the frontier himself but had conveniently forgotten that detail. The third man said nothing, just spit tobacco juice into the dirt. Sadie did not stop walking. She had learned long ago that turning toward that kind of laughter only fed it. She had learned a great many things in her 28 years, most of them not taught in any schoolroom. She had come to Dry Creek because her brother, Thomas Garrison, had written to her from this exact address 18 months ago saying he had staked a claim on a piece of land northwest of town that had good water and better grass. He had said the land was worth something. He had said she should come. And then, 4 months after that letter, a different letter had arrived written not by Thomas, but by a man who identified himself only as the town doctor, informing her that Thomas Garrison had died of a fever that swept through the settlement the previous November. She had read that letter sitting at a kitchen table in St. Louis, and she had let herself grieve properly for 2 weeks. Then she had packed her trunk. Thomas's land was hers now by inheritance, and she intended to keep it. The land office sat at the far end of town, a narrow building with a green door that had faded to the color of old sage. Inside, a man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers looked up from his ledger when she walked in. "I am here to file continued claim on the Garrison parcel," she said. "Northwest quarter, 40 acres, filed by Thomas Garrison in autumn of 1876. The man with the spectacles blinked at her. "You are Sadie Garrison, his sister, his next of kin and lawful heir." He found the record. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle on her back. "That is good land," he said, as if warning her. "I know," she said. "That is why I am keeping it." She paid the continuation fee, received her copy of the deed, folded it inside her coat against her chest, and walked back out into the spring morning. That was how Sadie Garrison came to Dry Creek, and that was how the town first met her, quiet, deliberate, and entirely unmoved by the opinions of men sitting on porches. Paul Keating had been ranching the land adjacent to the Garrison parcel for 2 years, and he had known Thomas well enough to drink coffee with him on cold mornings and argue about cattle prices in the friendly way that frontier neighbors did. He had liked Thomas. Thomas had been a steady sort of man, not loud, not foolish, careful with his animals and his word. When Thomas died, Paul had felt genuine sadness. When the spring thaw came and nobody appeared to claim the adjacent land, he had wondered whether it would go to auction. He had even thought privately that he might put in a bid. The water on that parcel fed into his own creek, and good water was everything out here. He was mending the eastern fence line the morning Sadie Garrison rode out to her property for the first time, and he did not hear her coming until her horse was 20 feet away, because she rode with the easy quiet of someone who had learned that noise was a liability. He looked up, a woman on a sorrel mare, riding with her back straight and her hands loose on the reins. She wore a brown canvas riding coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather, and she was looking at the land around her with an expression he recognized, the particular kind of hunger that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with belonging somewhere. "You are on the Garrison parcel," she said. "I am mending their fence," he corrected. "Your fence, I imagine, if you are Miss Garrison." "Mrs.," she said automatically, then paused. "Widow Garrison, technically. I kept the name. My husband died 3 years ago." "I am sorry," Paul said, and he meant it. She studied him with eyes that were dark brown, the color of the earth after the first good rain. "You knew my brother." "I did. He was a good man. I am sorry about him too." Something in her face shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but opening. "Thank you, that is more than I have heard from anyone else in this town." Paul set down his wire cutters and extended his hand. "Paul Keating. I run the cattle operation to the east." She shook it firmly. "Sadie Garrison. I intend to run a homestead here." He did not say what some part of him thought in that first moment, which was that homesteading alone was extraordinarily difficult. He had been on this land long enough to know that the frontier did not discriminate in who it punished, and he had watched capable men break under it. He had learned also that this kind of observation was not always useful to offer immediately. "I will leave you to look at your land," he said instead. "If you need anything, my place is the second gate east. There is a red barn you can see from the ridge." She nodded, already turning her horse back toward the open ground, already reading the land with those quiet eyes. Paul watched her go and then stood very still for a long moment before picking up his wire cutters again. The first meeting of the Dry Creek Men's Civic Association, which was less a formal body than an excuse for 6 men to sit in the back room of the Copper Nail and tell each other what they thought about everything, happened to coincide with Sadie's second week on her property. Chester Hollies had organized it, as he organized most things, which meant he had told everyone to come, and then spent the meeting talking. "The Garrison parcel," Chester was saying, leaning back in his chair with a mug of whiskey and the manner of a man delivering a verdict, "ought to be sold. The woman has no business out there alone. She is unsuited for frontier life. You can see it plain." Around the table, men nodded with varying degrees of conviction. "She managed to get her fence posts in," said a quieter man named Abe Whitfield, who ran the feed store and tended to say true things at inconvenient moments. "4 posts," Chester said dismissively. "Any fool can drive 4 posts." Paul Keating was in the room because Abe had invited him, and because he occasionally attended these gatherings when they concerned matters that affected the surrounding land. He had said nothing up to this point, listening with his arms crossed and his coffee cooling on the table in front of him. "She has not lasted a week," Denny Frath was saying. "Come the first hard weather, she will be on the stagecoach back east." "She has lasted 4 winters," Paul said. The room went quiet. Chester looked at him. "What?" "She told me she has been homesteading since she was widowed 3 years ago. She wintered a parcel in Kansas before she came here. 4 winters on the frontier total if you count the one she spent with her husband." Paul picked up his coffee. "None of you have done that. Most of you came here in late spring and have never been more than a mile from a warm building when the temperature dropped. So she has survived 4 winters and you have told her she cannot survive one, and you could all be quiet." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when men who are accustomed to not being challenged find themselves challenged in a way they cannot easily dismiss. Chester opened his mouth. Paul stood up. "I have coffee to finish at home," he said pleasantly, and walked out. He told himself on the ride home that it was a matter of principle. He did not like unfairness, and what those men were doing was unfair. He had said what was true. That was all. He told himself this several times. He was still telling himself this when he rode past the edge of the Garrison parcel and saw a lamp burning inside the small dwelling Thomas had built, and felt something settle strangely in his chest. The days that followed were ordinary and therefore good. Spring in Wyoming Territory in 1878 was a tentative thing, brilliant one day, bitter the next, with a sky that changed its mind every few hours. Sadie worked from first light to last, and Paul, who had an honest reason to observe the adjacent property from his own work along the fence line, found himself noticing small things. She was methodical. She moved through tasks with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to conserve energy because there was always more work waiting. She repaired the roof of the small barn Thomas had started before he died. She turned soil for a kitchen garden with a steadiness that did not look frantic or desperate but simply purposeful. On the fourth day, she ran into a problem with her well. Paul heard the sound of something going wrong, a particular mechanical collapse that experienced homesteaders learned to identify, and climbed his fence to look. The wooden bracing around the well's upper shaft had rotted through the winter and given way. Not a catastrophic failure, but enough to make the rope pull unreliable and potentially dangerous. He went to help without overthinking it. She was inspecting the damage when he arrived, crouched at the well's edge with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, already diagnosing what needed to be done. "I have fresh timber at my place," he said, "enough to reframe the upper shaft." She looked at him. "What would that cost me?" "Nothing. Thomas lent me his ox twice last summer and never asked anything for it." She considered this the way she considered everything, directly, without pretense. "All right," she said, "but I help with the work. I did not expect otherwise." They worked together through the afternoon. She was not merely helpful in the way that someone unfamiliar with tools is helpful handing things over and standing back. She was genuinely competent, fitting joints and driving braces with a confidence that came from having done this kind of thing before. She had strong hands, he noticed. Not in a coarse way, but in the way of someone who used them constantly for real purposes. "You built your own well before," he said at one point. "In Kansas." "The first winter. The original well froze solid and the wooden casing cracked. I had to rebuild it in February." She was fitting a mortise joint as she spoke, not looking up. "Not my favorite February." "Where did you learn to do this, the joinery?" "My father was a carpenter. He taught me alongside my brothers because he said there was no logical reason why the girls in the family should not know how things were built." She paused. He was ahead of his time in that regard. Paul watched her hands for a moment. "He sounds like a good man." He was. She drove a nail with 3 precise strikes. "He died when I was 16. After that I learned the rest on my own." By the time the sun was an hour from the horizon, the well was repaired and tested, and the water came up clean and cold. Sadie stood and rolled her sleeves back down and looked at the structure with satisfaction. "Would you stay for supper?" she asked. "I have venison stew. It is more than I can eat." He should have said he had cattle to check. He had cattle to check. "I would be glad to," he said. The inside of Thomas's cabin, Sadie's cabin, was beginning to show her presence in ways that were not obvious until you looked. Small things. A piece of calico in the window. A row of herbs drying on a string near the stove. Books, actual books, 3 of them on a shelf Thomas had built, and a kerosene lamp positioned exactly right for reading. The stew was good. Better than good. She had made cornbread to go with it, and the cornbread was the kind that stayed soft instead of turning to rock on the outside, which was not a small achievement in a cabin oven. "The men in town have opinions about you," Paul said when they were halfway through the meal. He did not know exactly why he said it, except that he thought she deserved to know rather than to be surprised. She looked at him with no particular alarm. "Men in towns generally do. Chester Hollies in particular." "The large man with the red suspenders. That is him. He called me a city woman when I got off the stage," she said. He looked like the sort of man who calls every woman who did not grow up within 10 miles of wherever he grew up a city woman. Paul almost laughed. "That is accurate." "What specifically does he say?" "That you are unsuited for frontier life. That you will not last the season." He looked at the table. "I told them you had survived 4 winters and they could be quiet." She was still for a moment, and then she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between gratitude and something deeper, more careful. "You did not have to do that," she said. "It was true. True things are worth saying. Not everyone thinks so. I know." He looked back up at her. "But I do." The lamp between them burned steadily. And outside, the spring wind moved through the new grass with a sound like breathing, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, and it was not an uncomfortable silence at all. The summer unfolded in the gradual way that Wyoming summers do, warm days that felt like gifts after the winter, and evenings that cooled quickly and made you grateful for your coat again. Sadie's garden came in well. She had planted with knowledge, choosing things that would grow in the high plains soil, and by July she had tomatoes and beans and more squash than she knew what to do with. She brought squash to the feed store. She brought it to the woman who ran the post office, a sturdy widow named Mrs. Hargrave who had been suspicious of Sadie at first, and then became something like cautiously warm when Sadie helped her lift a barrel of flour that had been delivered to the wrong end of the porch. She brought squash to Paul twice, and the second time he invited her to look at the cattle he had been sorting for the fall drive, and she gave him her honest opinion on which animals would make the best weight, and her opinion was good. "Where did you learn about cattle?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Kansas." She was leaning on the fence, watching a roan heifer he was uncertain about. "My husband had a small herd." "Not large, but you learn what you need to learn." "What was his name, your husband?" "Robert." She said it with a simple care. "He was a good man, better than I knew to appreciate when I had him, the way you never quite do." She paused. "He died of a fall from a horse, March of 1875, quick at least." "I am sorry." "He would have liked it here," she said, looking at the mountains. "He was always saying the horizon was too close in Kansas." Paul did not say anything for a moment, just stood beside her at the fence in the companionable way they had developed, the way that had grown naturally between them without either of them deciding it should. "What made you stay after he died?" he asked. "On the frontier. Most women would have gone back east." She turned her head and looked at him with those dark eyes and a slight expression of surprise, as if no one had asked her that before. "Because it was mine," she said simply. "The work was mine, the land was mine, the decisions were mine. Back east I would have been dependent on someone else's charity and someone else's opinion of what I should do next. Out here I am difficult and stubborn and probably going to get into trouble, but I am myself." Paul looked at her for a long moment. "That is the most honest answer I have heard to any question in several years," he said. She held his gaze. "You asked an honest question." Something shifted between them in that moment. Not dramatically, the way things shifted in the novels she kept on her shelf, but quietly, the way the light changed in the evening, gradually and completely, until you realized the world looked different than it had an hour before. Chester Hollis did not give up his position easily. He was the kind of man who confused persistence with principle, and he had decided that Sadie Garrison being on that land was wrong, and he was going to prove it. In August, he went to the land office and raised a technicality about the inheritance filing, a matter of some obscure territorial regulation about the time window for continued claims. The land office man with the spectacles was named Gerald Poole, and Gerald was not exactly corrupt, but he was susceptible to the opinions of men he saw every day, and Chester was one of those men. Gerald sent Sadie a formal notice that her claim was under review. She came to Paul's door on a Tuesday evening with the notice in her hand and her jaw set in the way he had come to recognize as controlled fury. "He filed a challenge," she said. "Chester Hollis." Paul read the notice carefully. He had developed some knowledge of territorial land law out of practical necessity. "This is a procedural objection. It is not a substantive challenge to your ownership. Gerald Poole does not have the authority to overturn the original deed. Can he cause trouble? He can delay, which is what Chester wants." She looked at him. "What do I do?" "You write to the Territorial Land Commissioner in Cheyenne directly. You send your deed copy, the original filing record, and a statement of occupancy. You have been improving the land since March. That is documented by your filing. Chester cannot claim adverse possession because you have been present and active." He paused. "Do you want help writing the letter?" "I can write a letter," she said a little sharply. "I know you can. I meant, do you want a second set of eyes on the legal language?" She exhaled. "Yes. That would be helpful, thank you." They wrote the letter together at her kitchen table, the kerosene lamp burning between them, their heads bent over paper. She wrote clearly and precisely, and when Paul suggested a particular phrase from the territorial statute, she incorporated it without argument because it was genuinely better and she was practical enough to recognize that. The letter went out on Wednesday's Post Rider. While they waited for a response, something else happened. A man named Carl Briggs rode through Dry Creek heading west, looking for work on any ranching operation that needed an extra hand. He was 35, weathered, reasonably capable, and Chester Hollies paid him $20 to spend a week trying to create trouble on the Garrison parcel. Nothing violent. Chester was not brave enough for violence, but small harassment. Cut fence posts. Scatter livestock. The kind of thing that might convince a woman to give up. Carl Briggs cut 2 fence posts on a Thursday morning. Sadie found the cuts while doing her morning rounds. The cuts were clean and deliberate, not animal damage, not weather. She looked at them for a long moment, then rode into town and into the Copper Nail and stood at the bar in the daytime quiet and looked at Chester Hollies where he sat at his usual table. "You want to say something," Chester said, because he was not a subtle man. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I have been on this land since March. I have repaired a barn, a well, 40 feet of fence line, and a chimney. I have put in a kitchen garden, and I have fed half of this town squash that they did not pay for. I have not asked for any of it to be noticed." She paused. "I am noticing, though, that my fence posts were cut last night. And I am telling you that whoever did it should plan to wake up tomorrow morning and find me still on my land, because there is no amount of fence post cutting that is going to change that." The bar was quiet. Several men were watching. "I do not know what you are talking about," Chester said, but his ears had gone red. "You do," she said without heat. "And you can stop." She walked out. Paul had not been in the bar. He heard about it from Abe Whitfield, who described it with visible enjoyment. She stood there calm as Sunday morning and told him plain, Abe said, grinning. Chester looked like he swallowed a boot. Paul replaced the fence posts himself the following morning, bringing his own timber, and did not tell Sadie he had done it. She found him finishing the second post and watched him from her horse for a moment before dismounting. "I was going to do that," she said. "I know. I had the timber already cut." He looked at her. "Is that all right?" She studied him with that direct, measuring look. "Yes," she said finally. "It is all right." They worked the rest of the morning in companionable silence, and then ate lunch at the outdoor table Thomas had built, the one that faced west and caught the afternoon light, and talked about nothing particular for a long time, which was, Paul thought, one of the best ways to spend an afternoon that he had experienced in several years. The Territorial Land Commissioner's response arrived in September, and it was exactly what Paul had predicted. The challenge was dismissed, the claim was confirmed, and Gerald Poole received a formal note about the limits of his authority. Sadie read the letter standing in the post office with Mrs. Hargrave watching from behind the counter. "That is good news," Mrs. Hargrave said, carefully. "Yes," Sadie said. "Hollies will not take it well." "He will have to." Mrs. Hargrave studied her for a moment. "You know, when you first came, I thought you were one of those women who comes out here with ideas and no sense. And now," Sadie said, "now I think you have ideas and considerable sense." A pause. "And I should have brought you squash from my own garden. Mine came in well this year, too." Sadie laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her slightly, and Mrs. Hargrave smiled, and it was the beginning of something that would eventually become a genuine friendship. She brought the commissioner's letter to Paul. She found him in his barn in the middle of a complicated situation involving a calf that had gotten its leg caught between the stall boards. He was trying to free it without injuring it further, and he needed a second pair of hands without needing to explain that he needed a second pair of hands, and she simply came in and took the position opposite him and held the calf steady while he worked the leg free. When it was done and the calf was on its feet, uncertain but uninjured, she handed him the commissioner's letter. He read it. He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, not the small polite ones he gave regularly, but a real one that reached his eyes, which were the particular shade of gray-blue that she had been noticing more than she meant to. "Good," he said. "Very good. You helped write it. You won it." She was standing close to him in the way that the close quarters of a barn produced, and she was very aware of it in a way she had been trying not to be for several weeks. He was tall, not extravagantly so, but tall enough that she was looking up slightly, and he was looking down at her, and neither of them moved for a moment. "Paul," she said. "Yes. I am trying to figure out what is happening between us." He was quiet for a moment, with the calf making small sounds in the stall behind him. "I think what is happening," he said carefully, "is that I think about you considerably more than is reasonable for a neighbor." "I have been told I am not easy to care about," she said. "By people who meant it as a criticism. I think it was meant to be a criticism by people who did not understand that difficult and worthwhile often come together," he said. She looked at him. The barn smelled of hay and livestock and wood, and through the open door the Wyoming autumn light was gold and slanted and beautiful. "I am not very practiced at this," she said. "I was not practiced at it even when I was young, and now I am less so." "Neither am I," he said. "I have been alone on this land for 2 years, and before that I was running cattle in Colorado, and before that I was doing what my father told me to do, which did not include leaving room for much else." "How old are you?" she asked. 32. She absorbed this. "I am 28. "I know," he said. "You told me the week you arrived. I did not think you were keeping track." "I keep track of things that matter to me," he said simply. She stood there a moment longer, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She reached out and took his hand, not in a dramatic way, just held it, her fingers wrapping around his work-roughened ones in the dim golden light of the barn. He held her hand back. "All right," she said. "Let us figure this out then." "All right," he said. Figuring it out, in the practical language of the frontier, meant that Paul began appearing at Sadie's property with specific purposes that gradually became transparent pretexts. He came to look at a section of her roof he was worried about. He came to bring over extra apple preserves his neighbor's wife had sent over and insisted he share. He came on a Sunday afternoon claiming he needed to discuss the water rights on the creek that ran along both their property lines, and they spent 40 minutes on the subject, and then 2 hours talking about everything else. Sadie, for her part, rode over to help with the fall cattle sorting when he mentioned it would be a large task. She was good with cattle, and they both knew it. She stayed through the midday meal, which Paul cooked a particular skill he was not modest about, and she discovered that he made cornbread that was slightly better than hers, which she told him with great reluctance. "Only slightly," she said. "I will take slightly," he said. The town watched this developing situation with the intense interest that small frontier towns brought to any deviation from routine. Mrs. Hargrave was broadly approving. Abe Whitfield told Paul privately that he was about the luckiest man in the county, and Paul did not disagree. Chester Hollies had subsided into a sullen acceptance that he was not going to win the land dispute, and had transferred his energy to making comments about Sadie and Paul's friendship that ranged from crude to merely unpleasant, but nobody paid him much mind anymore. On an October evening when the aspen trees had gone gold, and the air had that crystalline sharpness that preceded the first real cold, Paul rode to Sadie's place at sundown, and she was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and one of her books, and the scene was so exactly right that he sat on the porch steps without being invited, and she did not object. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About whether you would consider coming to the harvest social in town this Saturday." She lowered her book. "As your guest." "Yes," she considered it. "You know what that will mean, what people will say." "I know what Chester Hollies will say. Everyone else will think it is the most natural thing in the world." She looked at him steadily. "Paul, I want to be clear about something. I'm not going to be a secret or a maybe or a gradually figured out situation. If we go to that social together, I need to know that it means something to you that is not ambiguous." "It is not ambiguous," he said, with a directness that matched hers. "I am very clearly in love with you." I have been trying to find the right time to say it, and I think the right time was probably several weeks ago, but I was being careful because you are worth being careful with." The golden evening light was on her face. She was very still. "You are not easy to be in love with," she said finally, echoing what she had told him earlier, but differently this time, applied to him. "I know," he said. "I am told I am stubborn and opinionated, and I spend too much time with my cattle, and not enough time being whatever it is men are supposed to be in social situations." "You are very good in social situations," she said. "You are the first person who has said so. The other people were wrong." He looked at her. "Sadie, I love you too," she said, "in case that was not apparent from the last 3 months." He stood from the porch steps, and she stood from her chair, and they were very close, and he took her face in both hands with enormous care, and he kissed her once slowly, in the autumn evening with the aspen gold and the mountains going purple in the distance. And it was the kind of kiss that had everything in it, all the careful slow building of two people who had both known loss and had learned not to be reckless with what mattered. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chin for a moment. "Saturday then," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. The harvest social was held in the long room behind the general store, which doubled for dances, public meetings, and occasional legal proceedings. Abe Whitfield had strung lanterns across the ceiling, and someone had brought a fiddle, and a second person had brought a guitar, and by 7 o'clock the room was warm and loud with the particular joy that frontier communities manufactured at every excuse, because they understood that joy required manufacture sometimes. Paul came to Sadie's door at 6:30. She had put on a dark blue dress that she had brought from St. Louis for exactly this kind of occasion, fitted through the shoulders, practical in its cut, but undeniably a dress rather than the canvas and wool she wore for work. She had done something particular with her hair. He stood in the doorway looking at her. "You look beautiful," he said, with no decoration around it, just the plain fact. "You cleaned your boots," she observed. "Extensively," he confirmed. She laughed and took his arm, and they walked to the social together. And the quarter-mile walk in the early October night, with the stars beginning to appear, and the sound of fiddle music drifting toward them from the lit windows, was one of the finest things either of them had experienced in some considerable time. They danced. Paul was not a natural dancer. He had learned out of obligation rather than enthusiasm, but he was competent, and he made up for his technical limitations with a certain genuine attention to his partner that more skilled dancers sometimes lacked. Sadie danced with the same focused precision she brought to everything, and they managed very well together, which neither of them had thought to wonder about in advance. Chester Hollies was there, as expected, and he watched them from near the punch bowl with an expression of consolidated disapproval. At one point he said something to the man beside him that made the man laugh uncomfortably. Mrs. Hargrave, standing nearby, gave Chester a look of such precise disdain that he went quiet. "He is not going to simply let this alone," Sadie said quietly to Paul during a break between songs. "No," Paul agreed, "but he cannot do anything about it. He will try. He has tried. He lost the land challenge and he lost the fence post situation, and the only thing he has left is his opinion, which he is welcome to." Paul looked at her. "Are you worried about him?" "I am not worried," she said. "I am observant. There is a difference." He smiled. "There is." The evening went on beautifully. Abe Whitfield's wife, a small, energetic woman named Helen, attached herself to Sadie with great warmth, and pulled her into conversation with several of the other women, who had been quietly watching and waiting to see what kind of person Sadie Garrison actually was. By the end of the night, Sadie had been invited to a Wednesday quilting circle and a conversation about establishing a proper school for the settlement's growing number of children, and she had accepted both. On the walk home, Paul insisting on walking her back, the night now fully dark and brilliant with stars, he felt a kind of contentment that he had almost forgotten was possible, a feeling of rightness so complete and simple that it was almost alarming. "Good evening," he asked. "Very good," she said. She was still holding his arm. The October air was cold enough to see their breath. I had forgotten what it was like to belong somewhere. "You belong here," he said. "You always were going to." She looked up at the stars for a moment. "Thomas would have been glad," she said, "that I came, that I stayed. I am sure he would. He would have liked you," she added. "He always liked steady people." At her door, he kissed her good night properly, with both arms around her and her hands against his chest, and the cold night air around them and the stars overhead. And when he finally rode home the long way around because he was not ready for the evening to be over, he was smiling in the dark like a man who had been given something he did not think he had a right to expect. Winter arrived in late November with serious intent. The first storm came from the north on a Thursday and laid 18 inches of snow across the territory in 2 days, and the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made outdoor work genuinely dangerous rather than merely unpleasant. This was the test, of course. This was what Chester Hollies had been predicting. And this was why Paul had spent a great deal of October helping Sadie prepare. Not because she had asked him to, but because they had discussed it practically together, the way they discussed everything and agreed on what needed to be done. Her firewood was substantial. Her larder was full. Her animals were in the barn with good bedding, and her water supply was protected against the worst of the freeze with the proper bracing they had built in the summer. She had lamp oil, candles, dried meat, preserved vegetables, flour, salt, cornmeal, coffee, all the necessaries in sufficient quantity. The first week of the storm, they checked on each other daily by prearranged signal. A lamp in the east window at noon meant everything was fine. No lamp meant come immediately. The system worked perfectly. By the second week, when the snow had compacted and travel was merely difficult rather than impossible, Paul rode over nearly every morning, and most days Sadie had coffee ready and a problem solved before he arrived. The second week brought a cold snap that killed her smallest hen, which she was philosophical about, and cracked one of the chimney stones, which she patched with a mixture of clay and ash that held for the rest of the winter. One afternoon in the middle of December, Paul arrived to find her on the roof, patching a section where the snow load had stressed an old joint in the boards. She was entirely calm about it, working systematically with a pry bar and replacement lumber she had pulled from the barn. He climbed up beside her without comment and held the boards while she nailed them. "You were going to do this alone," he said. "I was doing it alone," she agreed. "Now I am doing it faster." The wind was cutting. She was wearing every reasonable layer she owned and was still clearly cold, her breath coming in white clouds. "Sadie," he said. "What? Will you marry me?" She stopped mid-nail. The wind moved around them. Below, the snow lay white and perfect across her land and his land and the creek between them. She turned and looked at him, kneeling on her roof in December, and he was looking back at her with steady gray-blue eyes and no anxiety at all, not performing calmness but genuinely calm, because he had thought about this for weeks and he knew what he wanted with certainty. "On a roof," she said. "I did not plan for it to happen on a roof." "When did you plan for it to happen?" "I was thinking by the creek in the spring, but it turns out I cannot wait until spring." She looked at him for a long, measuring, deeply considered moment. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He took her cold, reddened face in his gloved hands and kissed her there on the roof in the December wind. And then they finished patching the joint together and climbed down and went inside where she had stew on the stove and coffee ready and the cabin was warm. And they sat across from each other at the table with the lamp between them and talked about everything practical. The joining of the two properties, the spring plan, the cattle, the garden. And the talking was the most romantic thing either of them could imagine because it was real. It was their actual future. It was specific and true. They were married in February. It was, strictly speaking, too cold for an outdoor ceremony, which meant they used the long room behind the general store again, the same room where they had danced at the harvest social, which felt right to both of them. Judge Hector Crane came up from Laramie for the week and performed the ceremony on a Tuesday that was cold but clear, with winter light coming through the small windows in long bars of pale gold. Mrs. Hargrave had helped Sadie alter the dark blue dress into something more ceremonial, new lace at the collar, her mother's brooch at the throat, her dark hair pinned up with unusual care. She looked, Paul thought when she walked toward him across the boards of that simple room, like someone who had made a decision and was entirely at peace with it. She looked like Sadie. He wore his best coat and a new neckerchief that Abe Whitfield had insisted on gifting him and which was dark green and surprisingly fine. Abe stood as Paul's witness. Mrs. Hargrave stood with Sadie. The ceremony was short and direct, which both of them preferred. When Judge Crane asked Paul if he took this woman, Paul said, "I do," with a conviction that made Mrs. Hargrave's eyes go bright. When the judge asked Sadie the same, she said, "I do," with a steadiness and sincerity that made Paul's chest ache in the best possible way. He kissed her as his wife, and the small gathering of Dry Creek residents who had come, more of them than either of them had expected, filling the room with real warmth, made a noise that was half cheer and half laughter, the kind of sound a community makes when something genuinely good happens in its midst. Chester Hollies was not present. Nobody had invited him. He was at the Copper Nail drinking and presumably having opinions, which was fine. Abe Whitfield made a toast with actual champagne that he had somehow obtained from somewhere and refused to explain. Helen Whitfield cried a little and then pretended she had not. Mrs. Hargrave ate 3 pieces of the wedding cake she had baked, a proper spice cake, dark and rich and extraordinary, with the satisfaction of a woman who had executed something well. Paul and Sadie left early, not because they were escaping anything, but because the ranch was an hour's ride and they wanted to arrive before full dark. They rode side by side through the February cold, through the white silence of the Wyoming winter, and they talked all the way about nothing particular and everything, and the sky above them was the kind of deep blue that winter evenings in high country produce, absolute and enormous, and the stars were beginning to appear as they rode up to the gate. "My wife," he said, trying the word. "Say that again," she said, "and I might believe it." "My wife," he said again. She rode beside him through the gate and he latched it behind them, and the red barn was lit from inside where the animals were settled for the night, and the house ahead had the particular dark warmth of a place that would be lit again soon, and it was hers and his and theirs, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The spring that followed their marriage was the most productive season either of them had ever had on the frontier, which they attributed partly to the good weather and partly, privately, to the simple advantage of not doing everything alone. They merged the management of both properties with the logical efficiency that characterized everything they decided together. The cattle operation benefited from Sadie's good eye for animal health, and she identified a weakness in the calf vaccination routine that had been causing preventable losses. Paul's building skills and equipment improved the homestead side of things: a proper root cellar, a substantially larger barn, a chicken house that was actually predator-proof. They worked hard and they worked well together, and every evening they sat at the table that now had both their books on the shelf beside it. His practical ranching manuals alongside her novels and her father's carpentry guide and her medical compendium, because she had taught herself basic medical practice out of necessity, and it had proved valuable more than once. In the mornings before work, they had coffee on the porch when the weather allowed, watching the light come up over the mountains. These were her favorite times, she discovered. The particular ease of silence with someone you trusted completely was something she had not expected to find again after Robert, and its return was so welcome that it sometimes caught her off guard. "What are you thinking?" Paul asked one such morning, watching her face. "That I am grateful," she said, "which is not something I say often." "No," he agreed. "I think I was afraid to be grateful for too long, in case it was taken away." He reached across the porch rail and took her hand. "It is not going anywhere," he said. She laced her fingers through his. "Neither am I," she said. The summer brought news from Cheyenne that would affect every ranching operation in the territory: a new grazing management regulation that was, depending on who you talked to, either long overdue or catastrophic, and the men of Dry Creek were divided about it with considerable heat. There were meetings. There were arguments in the Copper Nail. Paul went to several of these meetings and Sadie went with him, which caused some consternation among the men who had expected wives to stay home, and she participated in the discussions with pointed accuracy whenever a factual error was made, which was often. Chester Hollies, at one such meeting, made the mistake of telling her directly that her opinion on the matter was not relevant. "My opinion," Sadie said, "is backed by 2 years of managed grazing records from 2 separate operations, which is more documentation than anyone else in this room has produced." She set the records on the table. "You are welcome to read them." Nobody said she was unfit after that, not in public at least. What happened over the course of that summer was a gradual and not always graceful shift in the way Dry Creek understood Sadie Garrison, Sadie Keating. Now, though she used both names depending on the context, which was her own business, she was not universally loved because she was too direct for universal love and did not particularly pursue it. But she was respected. Even men who had expected her to fail by now accepted that she had not failed and was not going to, and that acceptance, while sometimes grudging, was genuine. Mrs. Hargrave became a true friend, the kind of friend who brought her food when she was ill in September with a cold that went to her chest and kept her in bed for a week, and sat with her in the afternoons reading aloud because it helped. Paul was a devoted nurse through this illness, more worried than he showed, making broths and ensuring she rested and generally applying the same focused competence to her recovery that he brought to everything. "You are hovering," she told him on the 4th day, though not unkindly. "I am attentive," he corrected. "There is a difference. In degree, yes." She looked at him from the pile of blankets he had assembled around her. "I am going to be fine." "I know you are," he said. "I would simply like you to be fine faster." She caught his hand. "Paul, I have survived worse than a chest cold." "You have," he said. "I am aware of that. It does not make it easier to watch you be unwell." She held his hand and let him hover, because she understood that his worry was love in its most practical form, and she was glad of it. By October she was fully recovered and the harvest was substantial, and the cattle had done well at the fall drive, returning better prices than either of them had expected. Paul came home from the drive with Abe Whitfield and 2 other men on a Thursday evening, trail dusty and cheerful, and Sadie had supper ready and the lamp bright in the window, and she was genuinely glad to see him walk through the door in a way that did not diminish with familiarity but seemed to increase, which she had not exactly expected. He kissed her and she let him, even though he was trail dusty, and then she sat them all down to supper, and they were loud and happy around the table, and she caught Paul looking at her across the noise with that particular expression. The quiet, private one that she had gradually come to understand was his version of everything he felt about her, distilled into one look, and she held it for a moment and looked back, and it was its own conversation. That winter was hard. Harder than the previous year, with an ice storm in January that coated everything in 2 inches of glaze that made travel nearly impossible for 11 days. The cattle needed daily attention regardless, and Paul and Sadie went out together every morning to break ice on the water troughs and check the livestock, bundled into everything they owned, working in the grim, determined way that winter forced. On the 8th day of the ice storm, Sadie told Paul that she was expecting a child. She told him in the barn in the middle of the morning work because she had been carrying the knowledge for 2 weeks, and the barn was where they were when she decided she was done carrying it alone. He was breaking ice off the water trough with a hatchet. She said his name, and he looked up, and she told him. He set down the hatchet. He stood for a moment without speaking, and she watched his face go through something she had not seen before, a fullness of feeling so complete that it had no single expression, just a shift of everything. Then he crossed the barn in 2 steps and took her in both arms, still in their heavy winter coats, and held her against him in the cold barn air. "All right," he said into her hair. "All right. You are pleased," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am beside myself," he said. She laughed, muffled against his coat. "That is a more emotional reaction than I anticipated." "I did not anticipate it either," he admitted. He pulled back enough to look at her. "Are you well?" "I am very well. The cold is inconvenient, but otherwise I am entirely well." "When?" "August, I think, late summer." He looked at her with those gray-blue eyes that she loved, that she had been looking at for almost a full year now and still found remarkable, and his expression was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life, that precise combination of joy and tenderness and total conviction. "You are going to be extraordinary at this," he said. "I do not know that," she said. "I do," he said. "I know you." She pressed her forehead against his, there in the cold barn with the ice-coated world outside, and felt the particular warmth of being entirely known and entirely loved, and it was the best feeling she had found in all her 29 years. The spring of 1880 came in like a promise kept. The ice broke early and the thaw was gradual, and the creek ran full and clear, and the land came up green with the kind of confidence that land has when it has been well tended. Sadie's pregnancy was uncomplicated, which she was grateful for and not entirely surprised by. She had always been physically resilient, and the work she had continued doing, modified for sense, kept her strong through the spring and into the summer. The doctor who came through Dry Creek twice a year, an older man named Dr. Fenn, who had been practicing medicine on the frontier for 20 years and had the pragmatic warmth that came from it, confirmed at his April visit that everything was proceeding well. "She is strong," Dr. Fenn told Paul, who had waited outside the cabin with the concentrated stillness of a man trying not to be obviously anxious. "She is," Paul agreed. "Do not let her do anything foolish in the last month." Paul considered this. "Defining foolish is going to be a conversation," Dr. Fenn laughed. "Yes, with that one I expect it will be." The summer was warm and the garden was extraordinary. Sadie had expanded it, adding peas and carrots and a section of herbs that had grown beyond their original plan, and the kitchen garden became something approaching a genuine enterprise when she and Helen Whitfield began selling preserved goods to the general store in town. The first money came back in June, $2 for 8 jars of tomato preserve and $1 for 6 jars of the apple butter that everyone in Dry Creek had apparently been waiting for someone to make properly. Paul framed the $2 and put it on the wall, which she told him was ridiculous. "It is the first money from your operation," he said. "It is worth marking." "Our operation," she said. He looked at her. "Our operation," he agreed. On a Wednesday evening in late August, when the light was long and golden, and the mountains were their deepest evening blue, James Thomas Keating was born. Thomas for her brother, James for Paul's father, and the order of the names chosen by Sadie, because she felt that Thomas had not been thanked enough for the land that had brought her here. He arrived with considerable energy and an immediate opinion about the world, expressed in clear, loud terms. Dr. Fenn, who had come to the ranch the previous day in anticipation of the timing and had spent the night in the spare room, caught him with practiced ease and put him in Sadie's arms. She looked at him. He was red-faced and indignant and perfect, and she held him with the kind of careful intensity that people bring to things they are terrified of loving too much. And then something in her face let go all the careful holding that she had been doing for years, since Robert, since Thomas, since the first hard winter, and she simply looked at this small person who was hers and Paul's and knew and said, quietly, "Hello." Paul was beside her. He had been beside her through the whole of it, which she had not required and he had not offered optionally. He had simply not left. He looked at his son and then at his wife and said nothing at all because there was nothing that would have been adequate. "He has your look," she said. "He has your chin," he said. "He has your very loud opinion about things." "That," Paul said, "is absolutely you." She laughed, which was the first time she had laughed in several hours, and the sound of it filled the cabin and went out the open window into the August evening where the Wyoming night was coming in over the mountains, blue and enormous and full of stars. In the weeks that followed, Dry Creek visited. People came with food and congratulations in the frank, generous way of frontier communities, where new life was celebrated without reservation. Mrs. Hargrave came and stayed 3 days, helping with cooking and laundry, and holding James with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised her own children, and was happy to hold someone else's. Helen Whitfield came with a quilt she had been secretly making since March, blue and white with a star pattern. Abe came with more champagne, and the same refusal to explain its provenance. Even some of the men who had once sat on the porch of the Copper Nail and laughed about city women came to leave a gift at the door, which was as close to an acknowledgment of being wrong as frontier men generally managed, and Sadie accepted the gifts without irony. Chester Hollies did not come, but he was seen leaving a wrapped package at the end of their gate one evening, which Paul found the next morning. Inside was a small wooden toy horse, crudely carved but serviceable. There was no note. Paul showed it to Sadie. She looked at it for a moment. "Put it in the toy box," she said. "James will not know the difference, and it will drive Chester mad to have been kind." Paul laughed and put it in the toy box. James grew the way healthy children grow in good places, fast, curious, and constantly into things that were not meant for him. By the time he was taking solid steps across the cabin floor, his father was watching him with the alert attention of a man who had learned that competence did not prevent catastrophe and vigilance was the only answer. "He is going to be trouble," Paul said one evening, watching James determinedly trying to eat a boot. "He is going to be brilliant," Sadie said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," Paul said. "No," she agreed. "In our family they are probably the same thing. They're family." The word had settled into everyday use so naturally that she sometimes forgot it had ever been new. The ranch continued to prosper. The grazing management regulations that had caused so much argument the previous year turned out in practice to be workable and eventually beneficial. The land was recovering in areas where it had been overgrazed, and the cattle were healthier on better pasture. Paul had been among the men who adapted early, which meant they were ahead of neighbors who had resisted longer. Sadie's preserved goods operation grew into something she had not planned. By the spring of 1881, she was supplying the general store regularly, and had begun taking orders from a hotel in Laramie that a traveling merchant had mentioned to a man who had mentioned it to Mrs. Hargrave, who had told Sadie in the tone of someone delivering news that required a decision. Sadie had written to the hotel, and the hotel had written back, and now she had a quarterly contract that was not large but was real and represented something she took considerable pride in. "You are running a business," Paul told her, looking at the ledger she kept for it. "We are running a business," she said. "Your apples, your labor on the press, your recipe, your relationships, your work." "And yours," she said firmly. He smiled. He had learned not to argue when she was being generous, because she was always deliberate about it, and arguing felt like refusing a gift. That spring she also began teaching 2 afternoons a week at the small school Dry Creek had finally organized, which was housed in a room added to the back of the church building. The schoolteacher they had hired from back east had arrived, taught for a season, and then married a man from 3 towns over and left, and the school had been without instruction for 2 months when Sadie offered to fill the gap until a new teacher could be found. She was good at it. She had not expected to be exactly, but she was. The children, 14 of them, ranging from 6 to 14, responded to her directness and to her genuine interest in what they did not yet know, which she treated as a problem to be solved rather than a deficiency to be corrected. By the end of the spring session, 3 children who had been told they could not learn to read had learned to read. A new teacher arrived in July, a serious young man named Mr. Aldridge, fresh from a teaching college in Ohio, and Sadie handed off the classroom with full notes and a considerable list of observations about each student. Mr. Aldridge was intimidated by the notes, and then, once he read them, deeply grateful. "You should have been a teacher," he told her. "I am many things," she said. "The frontier does not really allow for specialization." He thought about this and decided it was the most useful piece of advice anyone had given him about his new life. The summer of 1881 was also the summer that Paul's younger brother, Daniel, arrived from Colorado with a horse, a saddle, a letter from their mother, and the particular look of a man running toward something rather than away from it. He was 26, broader in the shoulder than Paul and with the same gray-blue eyes, and he rode into the ranch yard on a Tuesday in July looking like he was slightly afraid of how he would be received. He was received with coffee and supper and the spare room, and James, who took one look at his uncle and decided immediately that Daniel was the most interesting person who had ever appeared. "Your son," Daniel said, watching James attempt to climb his leg, "has no fear." "He is a Keating," Sadie said. "He is a Garrison," Paul said at exactly the same moment. They looked at each other and smiled. Daniel stayed. He had no particular plan except to be somewhere useful, and somewhere useful turned out to be here. And he proved himself within the first week by taking to ranch work with a natural aptitude, and by being genuinely good with James in the frank, uncomplicated way of young men who have not yet learned to be self-conscious about children. He built himself a small dwelling on the eastern edge of the property with Paul's help and Sadie's very detailed and occasionally exasperated architectural input. "The door faces north, and you will be miserable all winter, Daniel. Move it 15 feet and face it southeast." And by autumn it was weather-tight and his. "Your family is growing, Mrs. Hargrave observed to Sadie one afternoon at the post office. "It appears so," Sadie said. "You do not look displeased." "I am not," Sadie said, and she meant it with every part of herself. There was one evening in the autumn of 1881 that Sadie would remember for the rest of her life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything was exactly right. Paul had lit a fire early because the evening was cold. James was asleep. He slept with the total commitment of toddlers, completely and loudly. Daniel was in his own dwelling across the yard, and the light was on in his window, and from the main house you could see it, a small warm square in the dark, which was comforting in the same way that any light in the dark was comforting. Paul and Sadie sat in front of the fire. He had his arm around her and she was reading, still reading, always reading. She had acquired 2 more books since the marriage and had started a small lending arrangement with Mrs. Hargrave and 2 other women in town. And he was not reading anything, just sitting with her, which was something he did often and which she had finally stopped finding mildly puzzling. "You do not need anything to do." She had asked him about it early on. "I am doing something," he had said. "I am sitting with my wife." She had thought about this and then accepted it as one of the things that was simply true about him. This evening she looked up from her book and looked at the fire and then looked at him. "Paul," she said, "do you know what you said to me the day I first rode onto my land?" he thought. "I said I would leave you to look at your land. Before that, you said you were sorry about Thomas." "I was." "That was the moment," she said, "when I thought there is a person here who might be real." He looked at her with those steady gray-blue eyes. "It was the moment for me too. You were looking at the land the way I look at it, like you already belonged to it." "The land does that," she said. "It either has you or it does not." "It had you," he said. "Yes," she said, "it had me." Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what Wyoming nights did, enormous and cold and brilliant, the sky the kind of dark that only existed away from cities, full of stars in their thousands. The fire burned. James slept. Daniel's light glowed across the yard. The cattle were settled in the barn. The house held them, solid and warm. The house that Thomas had begun and that Paul had strengthened and that she had made into the particular place it was. She put her head against Paul's shoulder and he pulled her closer, and the fire said what fires say on cold nights, and they sat in the warmth of everything they had built together, and said nothing more for a long time, which was the most eloquent conversation either of them knew how to have. In the spring of 1882, Sadie told Paul she was expecting again. This time she told him over breakfast, sitting across the table from him in the morning light with her coffee, and she watched him absorb it with the same expression of complete, helpless joy she had seen the first time. "James will be 2.5, he said. "Yes, that is a good spacing. I thought so." Reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, capable, exactly as I was last time." She paused. "I would like to name this one myself if it is a girl." "What would you name her?" "Clara, my mother's name." "Clara Keating," he said, trying it. "That is a good name." "And if it is a boy, you choose," he said. "You chose the right thing last time." She considered. "Samuel, for no particular reason except that I have always liked it." "Samuel or Clara," he said. "Either is good. We will see which arrives," she said, and picked up her coffee. Clara Keating arrived in October of 1882, announced by the same October light that had been present for so much of their story, that particular Wyoming autumn gold, slanted and brilliant. She was smaller than James had been, and quieter about her arrival, and she had Sadie's dark eyes from the first day and Paul's measured, watchful expression, which on a newborn was extremely funny. James, at 2.5, was brought to meet her by Daniel, who had held him by the hand for the walk across from his dwelling and was now somewhat overwhelmed by the emotion in the room. James looked at his sister with enormous concentration and then turned to Paul and said, "Mine," in a tone of complete seriousness. "Yours," Paul confirmed. "Your sister." James appeared to accept this as satisfactory and then tried to give her his boot, which she could not use, but the intention was clear. Sadie held her daughter and looked at her husband over this small, dark-eyed head, and Paul looked back at her, and between them passed everything: the fence posts and the well and the roof in December and the winter kitchen, and the first cold morning on the porch, and the wedding in February and James arriving in August of 1880, and every morning since then, with coffee and the fire and the land rolling out in every direction under the enormous Wyoming sky. "We are good," she said. "We are very good," he agreed. Outside, the October wind moved through the aspen trees and they were gold, entirely gold, shaking in the light like something that could not stay and was beautiful because of it. And the mountains held everything in their permanence, and the ranch was solid around them. And James Keating sat on the floor trying to put his boot on Clara's foot, while his Uncle Daniel watched with his hand over his mouth to conceal his laughter, and Sadie Garrison, who had come to Dry Creek with a dead man's rifle and a live man's debt, and the kind of quiet that follows loss, who had been called unfit for the frontier by men who had never survived one winter, when she had survived 4, looked at everything that was hers and felt the particular completeness of a life that had turned exactly right. In the years that followed, Dry Creek grew. More families arrived, more buildings went up, and the town acquired a second general store and eventually a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms and Mr. Aldridge still teaching in one of them. The railroad extended a spur line that came within 12 miles of town, which changed everything about how the cattle operation worked: better prices, faster transport, and the particular civilization that follows rail lines like trailing smoke. Paul expanded the herd carefully, without the recklessness that the new rail access encouraged in some ranchers. He had always been a measured man, and Sadie had reinforced this quality by being herself beside him, because she was nothing if not deliberate. Together, they built the operation to a size that was stable and productive without being overextended, and the land reflected this: healthy, well-managed, consistently productive. Daniel found a woman of his own eventually, a widow named Ruth Pearson, who arrived from Nebraska with 2 quiet, serious daughters, and an organizational ability that applied itself to Daniel's somewhat chaotic approach to everything with productive results. They married in the spring of 1883, and the ceremony was smaller than Paul and Sadie's but no less genuine. And afterward Ruth's daughters ran around the yard with James while Clara slept in her cradle on the porch, and Daniel looked at Ruth across the gathering with the expression of a man who had not expected this and was completely undone by his own good fortune. "Your brother," Sadie said to Paul, watching Daniel. "I know," Paul said. "He looks like you did," she said. "At the harvest social." "I was not that obvious," Paul said. "You were extremely obvious," she said. He put his arm around her. "You were not exactly indifferent." "I was not," she allowed, "but I was better at hiding it." "You were not," he said. She laughed. "Perhaps not." Mrs. Hargrave, who had been watching this exchange from across the yard with a cup of punch and a smile, said to Helen Whitfield beside her, "They are still like that." "Still like what?" Helen said. "Like it is new," Mrs. Hargrave said. "It has been 4 years and they are still like it is new." Helen looked at them, Paul and Sadie, in the afternoon light, his arm around her, both of them watching Daniel and Ruth with that warm, private contentment, and she smiled. "Some people are lucky," she said. "Some people work for it," Mrs. Hargrave corrected. "And then they are lucky." Chester Hollies left Dry Creek in the fall of 1883, which was not a dramatic event. He sold his horse trading operation to a younger man and moved south, and the manner of his going was quiet in the way that is specific to men who have run out of arguments. He did not speak to Paul or Sadie before he left, and they did not seek the conversation. But on the morning he left, Sadie saw him from her window going past on the road with his loaded wagon, and she watched him go without malice. She had thought about Chester Hollies occasionally over the years, not with anger, though she had felt anger at the time, but with something more complex. He had been wrong about her. He had tried to act on his wrongness in ways that were harmful, but he was also, she had eventually understood, a man who was frightened of what he did not control, and his fear had come dressed as contempt because contempt was more comfortable. She had met many such men. She had not let them define her, which was the only answer she had found that worked. She watched him go and then went back to her bread that was rising on the counter, and that was the last she thought of Chester Hollies for a long time. James Keating at 5 years old was exactly what Sadie had predicted, brilliant and trouble in roughly equal measure. He had his father's physical steadiness and his mother's argumentative clarity, which was a formidable combination. He had already decided that the cattle were his personal responsibility, a decision the cattle had not been consulted on, and he spent considerable time each morning informing them of his opinions about their behavior, which Paul watched with a suppressed joy that occasionally broke the surface. Clara at 3 was different, thoughtful, patient, with a kind of focused attention that reminded Paul of Sadie working at the well in the first summer, that quality of looking at something until you understood it fully before proceeding. She collected rocks with great seriousness and kept them in a cigar box her father had found for her, each one chosen for reasons she could articulate with scientific precision that was remarkable in a 3-year-old. "She is going to be a scientist," Sadie said one evening, watching Clara arrange the rocks. "She is going to be whatever she wants," Paul said. "Yes," Sadie agreed. "She is." It was one of the things they agreed on without needing to say it directly. That James would learn ranching, because he wanted to, and Clara would learn whatever she reached for, and neither of them would be told that their curiosity was not appropriate for what they were. Sadie thought sometimes about her father in that regard, the man who had taught his daughters to build things alongside his sons, because there was no logical reason not to. She thought about what it would have meant to grow up with that principle explicitly stated rather than demonstrated through one good man's quiet practices, and she thought about how different things might have been for any number of women she had known if that principle had been more widely held. She could not change what had been, but she could do what her father had done: demonstrate, steadily and daily, by the life she actually lived. In the summer of 1884, when the operation was well established, and the family was settled, and the ranch had developed the particular deep-rooted character of a place that has been carefully tended, Sadie received a letter from a young woman in St. Louis named Alice Marsh, who had been given her name by a mutual acquaintance. Alice wanted to homestead. Alice had been told repeatedly that she could not. Alice wanted advice from someone who had done it. Sadie sat down at the kitchen table and wrote Alice Marsh 4 pages. She wrote about the practical realities, the supplies, the timing, the necessary skills, the particular loneliness of the first months. She wrote about the mistakes she had made and what she had learned from them. She wrote about the winters and the importance of preparation and the necessity of not letting other people's low expectations become your own. She also wrote, "Find good neighbors, not the kind who tell you what you cannot do, but the kind who simply come and hold the board while you drive the nail. They exist, even out here, especially out here. The frontier does its own selecting, and people who survive it tend to have at least some of what is worth having." She sealed the letter and sent it, and she did not hear back for several months. Then a letter came from Wyoming Territory. Alice Marsh had come. She had staked a claim 2 counties north. She was still there. Sadie showed Paul the letter. "You will have to write to her again," he said. "I already did," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. 34 years old now, her dark eyes clear and warm and entirely certain. The woman who had come to this land with a rifle and a deed and the quiet of someone who had survived everything she needed to survive, and had found on the other side of that surviving something she had not known to look for. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just looking at you. You do that often." "I plan to continue," he said. She leaned across the table and kissed him in the kitchen in the midday, for no particular reason except that he was there and she loved him, and she was not in the habit of not saying or doing things that were true. "Good," she said. Outside, James was yelling something at the cattle. Clara's voice followed, lower and more measured, apparently correcting him. Daniel and Ruth's house was visible across the yard, and Ruth was in her kitchen garden and Daniel was doing something with a fence post. The mountain stood behind everything, permanent and enormous and indifferent in the way of ancient things, and the creek ran between the 2 properties where the water rights had been sorted and agreed on and respected for 6 years. The aspen trees along the creek edge were silver green in the summer light, and the cattle moved in the pasture beyond them like a slow painting. Everything was real and specific and present, and Sadie Garrison had put it here, had built it and kept it and chosen it and earned it, in 4 winters and 1 frontier, and the company of one steady gray-eyed man who had never once told her she could not, and had spent every day since the well's repair standing beside her and holding the board while she drove the nail. That was all it was. That was everything it was. And it was, by any honest measure, exactly enough.